Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. Just coming back from a little walk with my dog. Something that's been a bit of a long project for me is trying to figure out Hegel's aesthetics, his theory of art. Which is at base not complicated, really. It's actually, if you understand Hegelian logic, just like everything else, once you get how it works, makes quite a lot of sense. Now, I haven't read much of Hegel's logic, and that is because I like to just work things out for myself a little bit before I end up going and reading what the big man has to say, or what anyone else has to say. But usually I find Hegel the most convincing. So what does Hegel say about beauty? About art? Well, he says the fundamental concept of art is beauty. And beauty is what he says is the idea in sensuous form. And so what the hell does that mean? Well, the idea is the self-determined thing, as objectively existing. It is the self-articulated, self-determining thing. But what does this do with beauty? It's like, okay, something's independent. That doesn't mean it's beautiful. Well, it's not too far from much what we think is beautiful, actually, in many strange ways. For example, as Hegel says, well, the fundamental element of like concrete beauty in nature is life. Something like a living organism is beautiful because it is what it is. The beautiful is not beautiful because of something else. The beautiful is itself a fundamental thing, irreducible to anything else. You say, well, it's the idea in sensuous form. It's not a reduction of beauty towards idea, being a composite of idea and sensuous form. That is what beauty is. Once you comprehend it, that beauty is this process in relation of the idea to a sensuous form. So, we see a tiger, and why do we think a tiger is beautiful? Well, beyond, the strange, ineffable things, like, well, its colors are beautiful, they please us, its shape, what it represents to us. The tiger in itself is beautiful because it is a free, independent entity. Because the idea is the truth, it is independence, it is freedom. Capture all of what we mean when we say things are beautiful. Well, not all things that are beautiful to a fully concrete sense, but they are beautiful nonetheless. So, for Hegel, you would say that, of course, anything and everything can be beautiful to the extent that it is idea, to the extent that it exists independently. And that independence is rather mundane. It's not a deep independence. We're not talking about absolutes. We're talking about, if you like the color red, well, the color red isn't you. It has its own level of independence. To that extent, it is beautiful. And Hegel in the Aesthetics gives quite a bit of a really nice rundown in the introduction to the history of aesthetic theories, such that It's the various notions that we have, and they haven't really gotten any newer nowadays. There's nothing new under the sun. Where certain people say, well, what is beautiful is what is moral. What is beautiful is whatever pleases us. What is beautiful is this or that. And he obviously gives examples in which, well, that's not what we really mean when we talk about like art as such. Because yes, things can be artistic and beautiful, and nonetheless be, for the purpose of something else. But when we're talking about art as such, why people create art for art's own sake, as an absolute, it's precisely just that. It's just art for its own sake. It's not art for pleasure. It's not art for entertainment. It's not art for teaching you a moral lesson. It's not art for edification. It is art for art's sake. And some people don't believe art exists for art's sake. Something Marxists would say. Art is always political. Art is essentially political. You're full of shit. But then art is not reducible either to just being pretty. Art is not just a feeling of I like this, which is what a lot of people seem to think. That art is whatever I feel is art. You see like a bunch of anime drawings. You can actually go to DeviantArt, and it's not just anime drawings. It's the art in general. And there's a mundane sense to art, and there's a deep sense to art. And when we're talking about like art for art's sake, we're talking about what we would call high art. There's another word for it, but it's not coming to mind right now. It'll pop up. And then there's art in that, let's say this, lowercase a art is embodied concepts. How about that? And capital A art is the embodied idea. And with lowercase a art, pretty much anything that has a conceptual basis of any kind whatsoever. And when we talk about concepts, remember that we're talking about structures of unity and dynamics of development. Anything at all. It doesn't have to be mental. So, maybe you like the color red. Sure, that can be art. That's lowercase art. You embody the color red, the concept of red, in a nice red canvas that you painted. It's just red. Sure, lowercase art. I suppose you want to give a sense of speed, to a painting, and you make it wind streak looking. Sure, yeah, that's lowercase art. That's a concept, and that is visually embodied in sensuous form. And when I say embodied, and when I say, in sensuous form, I'm not talking about representation. Hegel's not talking about representation. For Hegel, when you say, art means something, or art is this concept embodied, it's the same way that when you look at muscles do not represent strength. Muscles are strength. If you look at a painting or a picture and you see, the speed blur, that doesn't represent, that's not a symbol for speed, that is speed. You look at a pillar of light shining down on somebody, and you're like, and that doesn't represent holiness. Like, that is what holiness looks like, right? so that's what that is. And it's hard to talk about it if you don't have a sense of that, you know. Suppose you want to, make an angry piece of art, to showcase anger, to embody anger in what you're seeing. And what do you show? How do you show that? Without having to have a piece of paper explaining your piece of art, next to it. Which I think, by the way, it's an utter failure. If you need a piece of paper that's a page long explaining what your fucking piece of art means, you've utterly failed as an artist, in my opinion. Like, if your art does not actually convey itself as art, I don't know what you're doing. I mean, it's not the case that all art is immediately something that you get. There is art with a context, but you have to remember that art is, I haven't mentioned it, so I'll point it out right now. Art is art for an audience. Art is not just immediately comprehensible as art. Like, unless you have a cultural background, art is not something that you immediately get. Although, there are generalities of art in which you don't need to know the culture to know that this is something significant, even if you don't fully know what is significant about it. Nonetheless, with any good universal piece of art, you will get the general gist of what it's like, of what it is. For example, this is something that I hadn't thought about until I read it from, I didn't read it from Hegel, but I read it about somebody talking about the aesthetics of Hegel. And as Hegel says, for example, that you could see Egyptian culture and, its spiritual awareness in its art. And its art is its architecture, its myths, its stories, its cultural practices, religion. And I mean, we all know generally that Egypt was all about the afterlife. All about the afterlife, that this life was not it. You're here for just a moment, and you better be a good person. You better, be ready for the weighing of the heart, when you die, because that's the real goal. This life is ephemeral, but there is an eternity. And so why is, Hegel says, why is it that Egyptian art happens to be rigid poses, happens to generally favor stone and these big large monuments? And he's like, because that's precisely the concepts that dominated the Egyptian spirit. They show themselves in the artwork. That once you grasp that Egyptians were all about the afterlife and eternity, well, of course, stone and rigid poses would be the mode of expression. The way to express that concept. You're going to express it in the one thing that lasts the fucking longest time. You're going to make those poses in ways that structurally they're just going to be solid. If you do something like Greek statues with contrapposto, it's not that the Egyptians didn't fucking know that they could do that. They did. They just knew that shit wouldn't last anywhere near as long as a fucking gigantic, solid, rigid statue. Once you get that into your head, you're like, wow, that's so true. Another one is it's Greece. The idea that why did Greek people focus so much on the physical body, the beauty of the physical, as well as, that the gods were so human. Well, it wasn't, Hegel says, imminent to, maybe they weren't fully aware of it, even though apparently the philosophers, when you read them, they must have been aware of it, that the human being is divine. Why are the gods human looking? Why focus so much on the perfect symmetry and beauty of the human body? Because that's what Greek culture was. It was this acknowledgement and acceptance and raising of the human in unity with the divine. That the human body was divine, that the human gaze was divine, that human mind was divine, all of these things. And when you grasp that, that's amazing. It brings some understanding. A sublime piece of work. Something like the paintings of Bierstadt, a famous German painter who traversed the Americas, and mainly did a lot of paintings here of the mountains, Yosemite and stuff. And you look at these, and these are sublime paintings. They are large scale. They're supposed to just make you feel small. And you look at them, and nature looks glorious, absolutely glorious. I love those paintings. And you don't have to stand back. You don't need a fucking paragraph. You don't need a page. You don't need anybody at all to tell you what the fuck those paintings are about. You see it. You see the concept. That is what art is. You see the concept. If somebody has to fucking tell you in words, they fucking failed as an artist. Because, and returning back to the whole thing that art is for an audience, an artist makes art for his culture. And if he makes art that the culture, the people in that culture simply cannot understand, he has failed, or she has failed. They have failed. Let's not forget the people who are non-binary. They have failed to communicate what it is that they want to communicate. Now, I'm not saying that art is always art for an audience out there. You might be your own audience as an artist. You might not create a piece for anybody else. You just want to express something to yourself, in the creative act and in the act of just enjoying your artistic creation. But you have the background in which you see the concept before you. Nobody has to explain it to you. And when you look at that thing, you don't have to run it through your head again and go like, oh yes, this means that, this means that. No, you see it. You see the concept. So what's my interest in that, anyways? My interest in that is that obviously the modern argument now, the one that's probably the most interesting, is no longer simply what is art. It's this idea that are video games art? A lot of people want to say yes, a lot of people want to say no. And the question is why? We have this general notion nowadays, it seems to me like it's the general concept people have, that art is just simply subjective, that art is actually not, that there really is, and let me put it this way, if you think art is subjective, that, art is only in the eye of the beholder, then what you're really saying is there is no such thing as art. Period. Because if you're not capable of defining it, you don't actually have anything. If art is anything, then art is nothing. Simple as that. But if that's what we really feel art is, then there would be no question being put forth about are video games art. We wouldn't care. I would say, oh, well, that's nice. I don't think so, so bye. No argument. It's art for you, but it's not art for me. Therefore, when we're talking about art, we're not talking about anything. But nonetheless, art has this high status in society. I mean, we still think art with a capital A is something deeply meaningful. Even though, we turn around immediately and go ahead and say, oh, well, anything and everything is art. It's just all in the eye of the beholder. But we don't actually believe that. It's very obvious that we don't actually believe that. We do believe that art has this deep significance which is why the people who want to argue that video games are art or aren't art have an argument to begin with. They want to, the people who want to claim that video games are art want to claim that high sense of spiritual meaning and importance that art has. And the people who don't want to accept that video games are art are people who want to protect what they deem to be that high sense and significance of art, and not to demean it by watering it down, by including something that, you know, just really isn't. And so almost 2 years ago, I started just writing something out that about well, you know, let's just go with this idea that art is, you know, basically the concept of beautiful, and the concept of beautiful is basically you know, the idea in sensuous form. And, you know, do video games fall within that, and what does that mean? And I ended up writing a hell of a lot more on that than I had anticipated, because I wanted to just clarify what is the general notions people have of art, what is my notion of art, you know, in a general, generative, formal sense. What is a video game? You know, what is it that video games actually are, such that you know, they may or may not qualify as art immediately. I mean, an easy counter argument that video games are art, if you're just coming from the absolute art standpoint, capital A art for its own sake, the immediate thing you throw out is this: video games aren't capital A art, they aren't high art, precisely because video games are something that are supposed to be fun. Art cannot be subservient to some other purpose other than, you know, the art's unity with itself. It can't have to be fun. It can't simply be, you know, made for a moral purpose. It can't be done for any other purpose than for the fact that it's art. But then the question comes in, you know, I kind of went with that and said, okay, well, you know, that's too easy, you know, that's just too easy. It seems lazy. What if, you know, let's just forget that argument there exists, and let's actually be charitable here. Let's be charitable and consider, well, what if this objection is just completely ignored? And we go with, let's assume they are. How are they art? How could they be art? If they are art, let's explain to ourselves, let's investigate, how are they art? You know, how does, one, what is the uniqueness of the video game? And two, how does that uniqueness provide us a new dimension of embodiment for concepts? And that's the issue where I got stuck, because there are and there aren't ways in which we can make sense of there being a concept embodied in gameplay itself. And that is the key thing, that the unique thing about video games compared to other arts is video games are not just interactive. There's the element of gameplay. And so what about gameplay adds something which all the other forms of art do not have, and which is a new dimension for conceptual embodiment, such that, for example, if I'm playing a drama, you know, it's a dramatic game, I can hear the drama in the music, I can see the drama in the clothes, in the geography, I can see the drama in the architecture, I can see all these things of the fundamental concept of that whole artistic unity. But can gameplay be dramatic? As gameplay, you know, not just simply, oh, well, it seeks controls along with, you know, me watching things on TV, on the screen. You know, how can gameplay itself be dramatic? Because almost every other form of art has a uniqueness to it, which in itself is a unique new form of expression in which you can embody the concept. You have sculpture, you have and dancing, in the plays, in singing and music, in poetry, in writing, in photography, in film. You have all these things, and each one uh, gives you something that the other pieces of art, the other forms of art, do not. And there are higher and lower orders of artistic determination. A film has far greater determination than a mere sculpture does. Dancing has more determination, more definition, more content that can appear than a sterile still statue. uh, you know, Singing has more to it than just instruments, lyrical music. Um, Film has more to it than a play, in that film allows you a new dimension of interaction, which allows you to show new concepts, which are not things that you can show in a play. And this is not, do not make this mistake. A lot of people want to say, oh, if you put a hierarchy to art that way, that's horrible because, you're saying these art things are better than others. And, I think music is the highest and they think painting is the highest and this person thinks film is the highest. It's not about that. There's actually, I think, a big investigation to be made about what the meaning of the relation of the personal to the objective has to do with the nature of art as such. Because I don't think there is a disconnection, which is to say that I don't think there are pieces that are meant for everybody. There are pieces which are absolute forms of art for individuals. There are also pieces that are absolute forms of art for a culture or society, and they don't overlap. And what is apparent to you as art may not be apparent to someone else. But what is apparent to them as art may be apparent, what is apparent to someone else's art may not be apparent to you. And sometimes you might see things from a certain part of culture which you are not familiar with, which you're not part of. Say you're someone who's a rapper, and you're seeing something that's supposed to be a deeply meaningful piece of art for someone who's into grunge or whatever. You're not going to get it, but the person who's into grunge completely gets it. They see the concept like that. Nobody has to explain it to them. They see it, they feel it, they hear it. It's there. The communication is in the background of the experience. Whereas someone who's into rap is a whole other thing. And you can have concepts which are generally about the same thing. The concept of life, just general life in general, the fact that you are alive, that you are an individual, that you are free, that you have choices, that you are responsible for those choices. Myriad of ways that you can make this story, myriad of ways, and some of them are more universal in that there are more people who will resonate with that, because they have that background experience, and some of them are more specific. And for being more specific as opposed to more general does not make these pieces better than each other. Although there is a sense in which if you have a piece that is reflective of a society in general, that piece may actually have all these other special, specific forms of life also present in it. So you may have a highly detailed cultural show of this concept, such that you see, for example, you want to make a art piece about capitalism as a form of life, and you see this from the eyes of the CEO, and then you see it from the eyes of the workers, and then you see it from the eyes of the black person, and then you see it from the eyes of the gay person. You see it from the eyes of the aesthetic person who is just deeply into art. You see it from the eyes of somebody who's deeply nihilistic. You can have all these within one story, or you can have each one be their own more fleshed out form of this story. Nonetheless, it is the same story. It is the same concept. And so what I was saying earlier about video games, or rather to finish this point, to go back to what I was saying with this point, these aren't necessarily better. There are personal absolutes and there are objective, social-wide absolutes. But this does not say music is less than painting. This does not say that film is better than whatever. It does not say any of that. And to go back to video games, the big question for that for me is what is unique to video games that could be considered artistic, that isn't going to be something else? Because video games don't have to be art. A lot of people want to say, oh my God, that's a terrible thing. I'm like, they don't. If they are, they're not. Doesn't matter to me. The question is simply, does it make sense to call them art? Somebody says, well, of course they're art. People get into it and they love the characters. I'm like, but that has nothing to do with the video game. It really doesn't. I mean, like, the story of a video game is not the video game. It's not the game. I love this character and I really connected with him. Yeah, you could have connected with them if you read like a fucking book. You could have connected with them if you watched a fucking movie. You could have connected with them if you read a comic book. That's irrelevant. And you say, well, the music was beautiful. Well, yes, the music was beautiful. The characters were beautiful. The story was beautiful. Was the gameplay beautiful? That's the question. I think that's the unique question. Was the gameplay, can gameplay be beautiful? Unlike anything else. And so that was the question about asking, can you have dramatic gameplay? Can you have sad gameplay? And I'm not quite sure whether I should phrase it that way even. Whether it has to be for itself, capable of just simply embodying the concept, or whether it can be an extension of the concepts for something else. Because when you say, for example, compare pure games like chess or soccer or sports, can you say there's something beautiful about that? Can you? Can gameplay embody a concept? And and I have this example of if you really want to, you could make the case that say something like chess embodies the concept of war. But it's not clear to me that is actually really embodying the concept of war, that really embodies the concept of conflict, in the senses that we really want to talk about that when we get a piece of art that is about conflict, or about the nature of conflict, about the consequences of conflict, etc. Those things are not apparent in chess, in my opinion, or Go, or anything else. There's just something very different. That's not to say, video games, by the way, it's just saying, video games are a concept. I'm pretty sure of that you can actually have a dialectic of games and video games. It's not very hard. I have the rudimentary outline for that, and so there's the concept of a game. It's basically what it is, and that's different to art. But that doesn't mean that you can't have syntheses. It just means that the synthesis is not an imminent synthesis of an artistic kind. The game as game will always be ultimately game. You play those games. Even people who love video games, I look around online for reviews. Some people that I like, oh my God, I can't remember this one guy who, I appreciate his reviews even though I don't agree with his style, or at least his conclusions some of the times. His style is pretty entertaining. And when he talks about why he loves a video game, he gives the aesthetic reason, but why he constantly keeps going back to it, is quite a bit for the gameplay. It's like, do you keep going back for the gameplay or do you keep going back for the story? And if you keep going back for the story, you don't have to play it. I mean, yes, if you want to get the full story, because just reading about it on that text is a whole different thing. But it's about the experience. So, are video games a unified experience? I think they are. But are they eminently unified as an aesthetic, artistic experience? Not fully. I don't think the gameplay itself is really part of the aesthetic experience. There is a way in which, like I said, there seems to be a sense in which gameplay can be aesthetic. And there's a couple of examples that some friends gave me, which were interesting, and they made me definitely step back and think and rethink my position, because my immediate position was obviously video games aren't art, and here's why. And then they offered me, and the reason was precisely because I couldn't conceive how gameplay could be aesthetic. And somebody gave me a couple of game examples about what might fall into that sense. There's a game called Brothers, and the gameplay in that struck me as like, that's really interesting. But when you look at the game and what people say about like the feeling, there's questions about whether that succeeds as a video game or not. When you subsume the game to an aesthetic principle, generally video games fail because people want to play games to have fun, not to have an artistic experience. But anyways, I'm starting to ramble too much, and see you around.